My name is Emily. I am 20 years old and currently a sophomore at a university in New Jersey. On the surface, my life may look like the life of a normal college student. I go to classes, work a part-time job at a bookstore near campus, and spend weekends studying with friends. But behind that appearance hides a story that changed the way I see family loyalty and survival. It happened on Christmas Eve of 2022, the night that turned what should have been a joyful holiday gathering into the most horrifying moment of my young life. That evening, the living room of my childhood home glowed with warm lights. The Christmas tree sparkled with ornaments collected over the years, the fireplace crackled with the smell of burning wood, and the long dining table was covered with plates of food prepared by my mother. Relatives laughed, children ran around, and holiday music floated softly in the background. It should have been a moment of comfort and unity. Instead, it became the stage for a scene that I will never erase from my memory. At the center of it all stood my older brother Daniel. He was 24 at the time, taller than most men in our family, and always eager to make his presence known. He had been telling a story about his high school days, an exaggerated tale he had repeated many times before. As he spoke, his words twisted small details that I remembered differently. Without thinking, I chuckled. It was not meant to humiliate him. It was just a soft laugh at how he mixed up the facts. In a normal family, it would have passed unnoticed. In my family, where Daniel's pride ruled like a law, it was a spark to gasoline. Before I even realized what was happening, Daniel's face darkened with rage. He glared at me as if I had insulted his very existence. He slammed his fist against the table, making glasses rattle. Then, in front of everyone without warning, he turned and punched me square in the face. I felt the bone in my nose crack under the force. Blood gushed down my lips and onto the white sweater I had chosen for the holiday. Shock stole my breath. For a moment, I could not move, only taste iron in my mouth and hear the collective gasp of the family. My mother froze. She covered her mouth but did nothing. Relatives sat in silence, their eyes wide, their bodies glued to their chairs. No one stopped him. No one shouted at him. The room filled with the sound of my sobs and the dripping of blood on the tablecloth. Daniel looked down at me with a strange mixture of satisfaction and anger, as if he had proven a point no one else understood. That was the night I realized the truth about my family. Daniel had hurt me before with words, with small acts of violence hidden behind closed doors, but this time was different. This time it happened in front of everyone under the Christmas lights when no one could deny what they had witnessed. It was also the night I chose not to stay silent anymore. It was the night I promised myself that Daniel would regret ever raising his fist against me. When I look back at my childhood, the memories often feel like they belong to someone else. There was a time before everything turned toxic when our family looked like the picture of stability. My father Robert was an engineer who loved solving puzzles and could spend hours tinkering in the garage with his tools. My mother Helen was a dedicated school teacher who came home tired but always found time to read bedtime stories. My brother Daniel was 4 years older than me, and when we were little, he was more like my playmate than my rival. We lived in a modest suburban house with a small yard where Dad planted tomatoes in the summer and Mom hung Christmas lights each winter. For many years, it seemed like we were living the ordinary American dream. On Saturday mornings, Dad would take us to the park to play catch, and Mom would pack sandwiches. At night, we had movie marathons with bowls of popcorn and blankets on the couch. Daniel and I built forts out of couch cushions and laughed until our sides hurt. Birthdays were small but meaningful with homemade cakes and the four of us singing together. It felt safe and warm, and in those moments, I believed nothing could break our family apart. When I was 7, Daniel helped me learn to ride a bike. He steadied the back seat and cheered loudly when I pedaled on my own for the first time. I admired him and wanted his approval. He was the older brother who could reach the highest shelves and knew all the cool songs on the radio. Even though we had typical sibling fights over toys or television shows, the fights never lasted long. At night, he would sometimes sneak into my room with a flashlight, and we would whisper stories until we both fell asleep. Our parents reminded us constantly that family was everything, and for a long time I believed that promise. Life felt steady and filled with routine comfort. The dining table was where we shared stories of our day. The small backyard was where we chased fireflies on summer nights. Every December, Dad carried the heavy box of ornaments down from the attic, and we decorated the tree while Christmas music played. Mom hung red stockings above the fireplace, and Daniel insisted on hanging his higher than mine. Even those silly competitions carried the warmth of affection. When I think about those early years, I see a little girl who felt cherished and protected. I never doubted that my parents loved each other and us. I never imagined how quickly it could all change. That sense of safety would shatter when tragedy struck. At the time, I was too young to grasp that happiness can vanish without warning. In those peaceful years, I built my identity on trust in my family. I clung to the belief that Daniel would always be my brother and my friend, but life was waiting to prove me wrong. When I turned 8, everything shifted. The world that had once seemed safe cracked open in a way I could not understand. My father, Robert, left for work one morning and never came back. He was killed in a car accident on an icy highway. I remember the phone ringing, the way my mother's hands shook as she held the receiver, the way her knees gave out and she collapsed onto the kitchen floor. I stood frozen, watching her cry into the phone, not fully grasping what had happened, but sensing with a child's intuition that life had just changed forever. The days that followed blurred together. Relatives visited food, filled the kitchen. Neighbors whispered condolences. I did not want casseroles. I wanted my dad. At the funeral, I clung to my mother's arm, looking up at her face, streaked with tears. Daniel, already taller than most boys his age, stood stiff and silent, his jaw clenched. From that day forward, he carried himself as though he had been assigned the role of man of the house. My mother, overwhelmed with grief, leaned heavily on him. She told him he was her rock, her protector, the one she could rely on. At first, Daniel seemed proud of the responsibility. He helped fix things around the house, spoke firmly to utility workers, and told me what chores I needed to do. I mistook his new authority for maturity. I thought he was just trying to fill the hole our father had left, but as the years passed, his role mutated. What began as helpfulness turned into control. By the time he was 16, Daniel decided he had the right to decide what our mother and I could or could not do. At first, it was small. He would tell Mom which bills to pay first, or criticize the way she folded laundry. She laughed it off nervously, calling him bossy, but thanking him for caring. He began deciding where I could sit at the dinner table, taking the seat at the head, as though he were the father. When I tried to sit there once, he pulled the chair back so suddenly that I stumbled. His grin carried a warning. Soon he began criticizing my friends. When I asked Mom if I could go to a birthday party, Daniel interrupted, saying it was not safe or that those friends were a bad influence. If I argued, he raised his voice until Mom gave in. He liked to stand in the hallway listening when I talked on the phone, and afterward he would mock my conversations, repeating my words in a sing-song voice that made me feel stupid. He ridiculed my hobbies, rolling his eyes when I practiced drawing or calling me lazy when I read novels instead of doing what he called useful tasks. Slowly, the house that had once felt like a refuge began to feel like a place of surveillance. My mother, still grieving years later, let Daniel's authority grow unchecked. She often said he reminded her of Dad, that he had stepped up like a true man. I wanted to scream that he was not Dad, that he was just a teenager who enjoyed making us bend to his will. Instead, I swallowed my protests because each time I pushed back, he became more aggressive. The night he confiscated my phone because I stayed up late texting was the night I realized I no longer had privacy. He read my messages and mocked me at breakfast, quoting my words to make me blush. Mom scolded him gently but did nothing to stop him. By then, I understood that she was afraid of upsetting him. She never admitted it, but the way her shoulders tensed when he raised his voice told me everything. Daniel's control grew, like ivy wrapping around the walls of our home, silent at first, but slowly choking the life from us. What once had been a bond between siblings now became a cage where I was the prisoner and he was the warden. By the time Daniel turned 18, his dominance over our household had hardened into something darker. He was no longer just a bossy teenager trying to play the role of man of the house. He had become unpredictable, angry, and frightening. His temper exploded over the smallest things. If dinner was late, he would slam cupboard doors so hard the dishes rattled. If I left my backpack in the living room, he would kick it across the floor and shout that I was disrespectful. At first, his violence was directed at objects, but soon it shifted toward me. The first time he shoved me, I was 14. I had come home from school humming a song I liked, and he snapped that my voice was annoying. When I ignored him, he grabbed my shoulder and pushed me against the wall. The shock froze me more than the pain. Mom ran in, saw what happened, and instead of confronting him, she whispered to me not to provoke him. She looked small and tired, her eyes begging me to stay quiet for the sake of peace. That became her refrain. Do not make him angry. Do not argue. Do not talk back. Peace at any cost, even if it meant letting her son rule us through fear. As the years rolled on, his tactics grew more insidious. He learned to twist words until I questioned my own memory. When I reminded him of a promise he had made to help me with a school project, he laughed and said I was imagining things. If I protested, he accused me of lying. He called me useless, stupid, selfish. The insults dug into my skin like splinters I could never pull out. Sometimes when Mom was out grocery shopping, he would corner me in the hallway, yank my hair just to see me cry, or snatch my phone and scroll through my messages. He always returned it with a smug grin as though daring me to tell on him. I knew if I complained, Mom would only sigh and ask me to be patient, to remember that he had suffered too after Dad died. I felt invisible in my own home. One evening at dinner, Mom mentioned wanting to buy a new dress for a school function. Daniel exploded. He slammed his plate against the wall, spaghetti sliding down the cream-colored wallpaper like streaks of blood. He shouted that she was wasting money, that she did not respect his hard work. She apologized again and again while cleaning the mess, her hands shaking. The next day, she returned the dress and wore an old one instead. I watched the light in her eyes fade a little more with each passing year. My home became a place of silence. Mom no longer sang while cooking. She checked with Daniel before buying even the smallest household items. She stopped inviting friends over. I learned to avoid being home. I joined after-school clubs, volunteered at the library, and spent nights at friends' houses whenever I could. When I could not avoid him, I locked myself in my room, listening to his footsteps in the hallway like a predator stalking its territory. Once, when I was 16, I saw Mom in the bathroom, covering a bruise on her cheek with makeup. She claimed she had walked into a door, but I saw the truth in her eyes. Daniel had crossed the line from intimidation to physical violence against her as well. I begged her to leave, to call the police, to do something. She shook her head and whispered that we were lucky to have him, that he was just stressed, that things would get better. Deep down, I knew she was trapped by fear and dependence. I realized I was on my own. Each insult, each shove, each slammed door was another reminder that this was no longer a family. It was a prison, and Daniel was the guard who held the keys. When I turned 18, I thought college would finally be my escape. I applied to universities far from home, and when I received my acceptance letter to a school in New Jersey, I felt for the first time in years that I could breathe. I imagined walking away from the toxic walls of my house, away from Daniel's rage and my mother's silence. With scholarships and a part-time job at a local bookstore, I began to build a fragile independence. I studied late in the library, surrounded by students who knew nothing about the prison I had left behind. For a while, it felt like freedom. Yet Daniel did not let me go easily. He called constantly, demanding to know where I was, who I was with, and how I spent my time. If I did not answer, he flooded me with messages, then turned to Mom and pressured her to demand I come home. He used her as a leash. When she said she was not feeling well, I knew it was his excuse to summon me back. Each time I resisted, he reminded her to guilt me into returning. Holidays became battlegrounds. I dreaded each visit home because the moment I walked through the door, he scrutinized me like an enemy. He inspected my clothes, sneered at my makeup, asked if I was trying to look cheap. He mocked my classes, saying psychology was a useless major and I would end up broke. When I tried to tune him out, he slammed his hand on the table and accused me of disrespect. Mom pleaded with me not to argue, her voice cracking with exhaustion. It became a twisted routine. I would taste independence during the semester, then return home to be dragged back into the same suffocating roles. Still, I fought for small victories. I saved money from my job enough to cover basic needs without asking Mom for help. I made friends who listened when I hinted at family troubles, though I never told them the full truth. I started journaling every encounter with Daniel, documenting his outbursts, his insults the moments he crossed the line. Part of me hoped that one day these records would matter. The more I tried to pull away, the more aggressive Daniel became. Once he accused me of abandoning Mom. He stormed into my room at home, yanked my suitcase from under the bed, and threw my clothes across the floor. He shouted that if I cared about family, I would stay instead of running away to college. I picked up my clothes silently, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. Inside, I was shaking, but also determined. I promised myself that he would not own me forever. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, was a seed of rebellion, but those seeds also carried danger. Daniel sensed his grip slipping and responded with more force. He shoved me against a wall when I laughed at a joke on my phone, accused me of mocking him. He once locked my car keys in his drawer so I could not drive back to campus until he felt like releasing them. Each time I escaped back to school, I felt relief, but also dread knowing that another holiday would come another excuse for him to assert control. The emotional cycle was brutal. Hope. When I was away, despair. When I returned, temporary relief. When I left again. I began to understand that freedom would not come gradually. It would require a breaking point, a moment when everything collapsed and nothing could be hidden anymore. That moment arrived on Christmas Eve, and it was far worse than anything I had imagined. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of crisp winter air that usually carried nostalgia and warmth. Snow dusted the sidewalks and houses on our street glowed with lights. Inside our home, the dining table was decorated with candles and polished silverware plates of ham and roasted vegetables, pies cooling on the counter. Family members gathered in their holiday sweaters, cousins laughed near the tree, and the smell of cinnamon filled the air. To anyone walking in, it would have looked like a perfect holiday. But beneath the glow, tension simmered like an invisible fog. I had been back from campus for 2 days and already felt the weight of Daniel's scrutiny. He criticized how I unpacked my suitcase, mocked my shoes, rolled his eyes at every word I spoke. I told myself to endure one night to smile and play along until I could escape back to my dorm. I did not know that this would be the night everything erupted. The evening began with chatter and clinking glasses. Relatives complimented the food. Children darted between adults, and my mother tried to hold herself together with a brittle smile. Daniel sat at the head of the table as though it belonged to him, his voice booming over others as he told a story from his high school years. He exaggerated details, painting himself as a hero. I remembered the event differently, and when he twisted the facts, I could not help but laugh. It was a small laugh, almost a reflex, but it was enough. His head snapped toward me, his eyes narrowing. The room seemed to fall silent, though conversation still buzzed. He asked what was so funny. I shook my head and said nothing. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. The sound cut through the chatter, and the room fell quiet for real. Then, before anyone could move, he rose from his chair, and with a speed that stunned me, he swung his fist into my face. Pain exploded across my nose, sharp and burning, followed by the hot rush of blood. Gasps erupted around the table chairs, scraped back, but no one came to my aid. I stumbled, clutching my face, feeling blood pour through my fingers. My white sweater soaked crimson. The shock froze me more than the pain. I looked to my mother. She covered her mouth, tears in her eyes, but her body stayed rigid. She whispered no words of defense. Relatives sat paralyzed, their eyes darting, their hands gripping the tablecloth. No one challenged Daniel. He towered above me, breathing heavily, glaring as though I had committed an unforgivable betrayal. The humiliation burned as much as the injury. I was not just attacked. I was attacked publicly in the one moment that should have been safe in the presence of everyone who should have protected me. Blood dripped onto the table, staining the cloth. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees. Daniel stood over me, chest rising and falling, lips curled in satisfaction. He muttered that I should learn my place. My ears rang. My vision blurred, but something inside me hardened. I lifted my eyes to meet his, and through the haze of pain, I whispered that he would regret this. My words barely audible, yet he heard them. The flicker in his eyes showed he had. The rest of the night blurred. Someone eventually fetched tissues, someone else called a cab. The party disbanded in awkward silence, relatives avoiding eye contact. My mother helped me to the bathroom, but her hands shook so badly she could not clean the blood. I looked in the mirror at my swollen face and broken nose and knew nothing would ever be the same again. The violence could no longer be hidden, not when it spilled across the holiday table in front of witnesses. That night marked the breaking point, the moment when fear transformed into defiance. I realized that I would not stay silent, not this time, not ever again. The cab ride to the hospital felt endless, though it lasted only 15 minutes. My mother sat beside me holding a towel against my face, but her hands trembled so much that the cloth slipped. I pressed it myself, wincing every time the car hit a bump. My reflection in the window showed a pale girl with blood smeared down her chin, eyes wide with shock, sweater ruined. I wanted to cry, but tears would not come. I was empty, floating outside my body. When we arrived at the emergency room, the bright lights stung my eyes. Nurses hurried me to a bed, lifted the towel, and immediately began cleaning the wound. The pain roared back with each touch. A doctor examined me, ordered x-rays, and confirmed what I already knew. My nose was broken. My face was swollen and bruised. There would be weeks of healing and maybe surgery. As the doctor explained treatment, I stared at the ceiling and tried to absorb the fact that my own brother had done this to me in front of our family. While I waited, a familiar face appeared. Jessica, my closest friend, had rushed to the hospital after I texted her a blurry photo. She gasped when she saw me and immediately took out her phone to document the injuries properly. She whispered that I needed proof, that no one could dismiss what had happened if we had pictures. She held my hand while the nurse stitched a cut above my lip and reminded me to breathe. My mother sat quietly in the corner, eyes, red fingers twisting her purse strap. She had not spoken since we left the house. When Jessica asked her if she had called the police, she shook her head. She said Daniel had lost his temper, but did not mean to cause serious harm. I could hardly believe her words. Jessica frowned and said she would call. Within an hour, 2 officers arrived, took my statement, and photographed the injuries. When they went to question my mother, she hesitated, then admitted Daniel had struck me, but added that I provoked him. My heart sank hearing her protect him even now. The officers assured me the case would be filed, but warned that without cooperation from family witnesses, it could be difficult. Daniel had already told them over the phone that he acted in self-defense, claiming I mocked him and lunged at him. The lie burned, but I stayed silent, letting Jessica's photos and the doctor's report speak. In the days that followed, I stayed at Jessica's apartment instead of going home. My face was sore, breathing through my nose impossible, but the deeper wound was the betrayal. Calls from relatives trickled in each conversation, a dance around the truth. Some offered sympathy but admitted they did not want to get involved. Others avoided the topic entirely, asking only about my studies. The silence enraged me. Daniel had assaulted me in plain view, and yet the family chose comfort over truth. The only solace came from the undeniable evidence: medical records, photographs, and the neighbor's security camera that had caught part of me leaving the house bloodied. Those pieces gave me strength. Lying on Jessica's couch with ice pressed to my face, I made a vow. I would not let this incident vanish into whispered excuses. For years, Daniel had controlled us with fear, and my mother had bowed to his temper. But this time, I had proof, and I had allies. For the first time in my life, I began to imagine a world where he would be forced to answer for his cruelty. Jessica was the one who planted the idea in my mind that night as we sat on her couch with ice packs pressed to my swollen face. She told me that silence had protected Daniel for years, and that if I wanted justice, I needed to break that silence loudly and publicly. At first, I hesitated. The thought of exposing my family's darkness to the world terrified me. But then I remembered the humiliation of sitting at that dinner table with blood dripping onto the cloth while everyone watched and did nothing. I realized that my fear had already cost me too much. The next morning, Jessica helped me draft a post. We included the photos of my injuries, a brief account of what had happened, and a message about toxic families and the courage to speak out. With my hands trembling, I pressed publish. Within hours, the post spread across campus. Friends shared it, then strangers, then local groups. By evening, my phone buzzed constantly with messages of support. Some were from classmates who confessed they had witnessed similar family abuse. Others were from complete strangers thanking me for my courage. The story was no longer just mine. It became a mirror for many. Local news picked it up 2 days later. A reporter contacted me, and with Jessica's encouragement, I agreed to an interview. Sitting under studio lights with makeup barely covering my bruises, I told the world what my brother had done. I described the years of control, the gaslighting, the way my mother had been silenced. The segment aired that night and sparked outrage. Calls flooded the station from viewers demanding accountability. On social media, Daniel's name trended locally. His coworkers learned the truth. His boss called to say he was suspended from his part-time job at the hardware store pending investigation. Friends who once laughed with him now avoided him. His carefully built image of the responsible older brother collapsed. At home, my mother faced neighbors who whispered and stared. For the first time, she could not deny the reality. She called me in tears, saying I had shamed the family. I answered with a calm voice I hardly recognized. I told her that Daniel had shamed us long before I spoke, that the world was only seeing what he had done. She had no reply. The police investigation intensified as the public pressure grew. Officers collected Jessica's photos, my medical records, and statements from relatives. Some who had stayed silent at first now admitted the truth when questioned by law enforcement. One uncle confessed he had seen everything but had been afraid to confront Daniel. Another aunt admitted she felt sick watching me bleed but could not move. Their shame became my vindication. As weeks passed, I began to regain strength not only in my body, but in my resolve. My bruises faded, but the fire inside me grew. I started attending support groups for survivors of domestic violence, speaking carefully at first, then more boldly. Each time I shared my story, I felt chains breaking. Daniel, meanwhile, avoided public places. He deleted his social media accounts. He tried calling me once, leaving a voicemail filled with fury, accusing me of betrayal, swearing I had ruined his life. I saved the recording and sent it straight to the police. The evidence mounted. My mother grew quieter with each passing day. Eventually, she admitted she had lived in fear of him for years, but had convinced herself silence was safer. For the first time, she said she was sorry. Her voice cracked as she told me that watching me bleed on the dining room floor had shattered her illusions. She confessed she could no longer protect him. That admission gave me unexpected relief. The girl who had been silenced was finally being heard. The revenge was not in fists or screams, but in truth laid bare. Every share of my post, every headline, every whisper on the street was a blow against Daniel's control. For the first time, he was the one cornered, exposed, powerless. The trial began 3 months later in a county courthouse that smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. I walked through the heavy doors wearing a plain suit borrowed from Jessica's older sister, my hair tied back so the jury could see the faint line of scar above my lip. My heart pounded, but I held my head high. Daniel sat at the defense table in a tailored jacket, his expression carefully arranged to appear calm. He glanced at me once with eyes full of contempt before turning away. The judge entered, the jury settled, and the proceedings began. The prosecutor laid out the case in steady detail, starting with the years of controlling behavior, escalating to physical violence, and culminating in the assault on Christmas Eve. Photographs of my injuries were displayed on a screen, each one making my stomach twist, but also strengthening my resolve. The medical report confirmed the broken nose and deep bruising. Jessica took the stand and described the night she rushed me to the hospital, her voice steady even when Daniel's lawyer tried to undermine her. The lawyer claimed she was biased because of our friendship, but Jessica never wavered. She told the jury that truth did not require neutrality when the evidence was clear. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand with legs that felt like stone. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down facing the courtroom. My voice shook at first as I recounted childhood memories, the slow transformation of my brother from protector to tormentor, the way he dictated where I sat, who I could see, and what I could do. I described the night of Christmas Eve in excruciating detail, from the laughter that triggered his rage to the crack of bone as his fist met my face. I told them how the blood poured, how no one intervened, how humiliation cut deeper than pain. The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens. When the defense lawyer rose, he attacked with sharp words. He accused me of exaggerating, of seeking attention, of trying to ruin my brother's life. He asked if I had laughed to provoke him, if I had fabricated past abuses. Each question was meant to rattle me. I gripped the edges of the chair and answered calmly. I told him laughter is not a crime, that no provocation justifies a broken nose, that the bruises and medical reports spoke louder than his insinuations. My mother testified next. She looked fragile, walking to the stand, her hands clasped tightly. At first her voice was barely above a whisper, but as she spoke, it grew stronger. She admitted years of silence, confessed to watching him control both of us, and acknowledged that fear had kept her obedient. When she described seeing me collapse in blood while frozen in place, tears streamed down her face. She told the court that her silence ended that night. The jury watched her with a mixture of sympathy and sorrow. Neighbors who had heard shouting relatives who had witnessed fragments of Daniel's temper and experts on domestic abuse all added their voices. Piece by piece, the image of Daniel as a respected young man crumbled. On the final day, closing arguments were delivered. The prosecutor reminded the jury of every photograph, every bruise, every voice that had testified. The defense tried to paint me as vindictive and unstable, but the evidence outweighed the words. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before filing back into the courtroom. My breath caught as the foreman stood. On the charge of assault and battery, the defendant is found guilty. On the charge of causing grievous bodily harm, the defendant is found guilty. Relief washed through me so powerful I nearly collapsed. Daniel's face hardened, his mask slipping to reveal pure rage. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in state prison, citing the severity of the attack and his lack of remorse. As deputies led him away in handcuffs, he twisted his neck to glare at me, but for once the power was mine. I met his eyes without flinching and felt the weight of years of fear lift from my chest. After the sentencing, I expected to feel only triumph, but what settled inside me was a complicated mixture of relief and exhaustion. For the first time in years, the constant tension in my shoulders eased, yet beneath that calm was a hollow ache. Healing did not come overnight. I moved into a small apartment near campus with Jessica as my roommate, and every morning I woke up grateful to lock the door behind me without fear of Daniel's footsteps in the hallway. My nose healed slowly, the swelling gone, but tenderness remaining whenever I touched the bridge. Each time I looked in the mirror, I saw both the scar of violence and the symbol of survival. I began therapy with a counselor who specialized in family trauma. In those sessions, I unpacked years of bottled anger, shame, and guilt. I admitted how often I had blamed myself, how deeply I resented my mother for her silence. The counselor reminded me that trauma distorts love, that fear masquerades as loyalty, and that my feelings were not weakness but human. My mother started attending a support group for women trapped in toxic households. For the first time, she began to speak honestly about the control Daniel had over her. Slowly, she built friendships outside the shadow of my brother's timid steps, but real ones. She visited me often, bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting on my couch in quiet companionship. Our conversations were awkward at first, but over time, honesty replaced silence. One evening, she confessed that she had spent years convincing herself that enduring Daniel's anger was better than losing him. She cried as she told me she now understood the cost of that belief. Hearing those words lifted a weight I had carried alone. Academically, I thrived. The experience fueled my desire to pursue psychology and advocate for victims of abuse. I wrote essays that professors praised for their raw insight. I joined a student organization that volunteered at shelters, speaking to women who reminded me of my mother and girls who reminded me of myself. Each time I shared my story, their eyes widened with recognition and hope. The nights were hardest. I woke from dreams of blood on white cloth of fists shattering bone. But with therapy, the nightmares lessened. I practiced breathing exercises, kept a journal of gratitude, and painted canvases with bold colors to express emotions I could not articulate. My scars became not a mark of weakness, but proof of endurance. By the time spring arrived, I felt stronger than I ever imagined possible. I learned that rebirth does not mean forgetting the past. It means carrying it differently, allowing the pain to fuel growth rather than fear. Standing in front of the camera, months after the trial, I spoke not as a victim, but as someone who had survived and transformed. I looked directly into the lens and let my words flow from the deepest part of my truth. I told viewers that if they had ever been silenced by control or struck down by violence, they needed to know that their voice mattered. I explained that on Christmas Eve, my own brother had broken my nose in front of everyone I loved, and for years before that, he had chipped away at my spirit with insults and fear. Yet here I was still standing. I reminded them that silence only protects the abuser and that speaking out is the first step toward freedom. I urged them not to wait for permission to defend themselves. I admitted that I had once believed my family would never change, but the moment I chose to expose the truth, everything shifted. I ended with a vow that I would dedicate my future to helping others escape the chains of toxic families and reclaim their lives. Then I asked viewers to share my story so it could reach someone sitting in silence tonight. I invited them to subscribe to hear more journeys of survival and justice, because every time we break the silence, we build a world where violence loses its power.